Amber Ellis tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her rusted sedan crawled up the winding country road. The January air was sharp, biting through the cracked windows, but she didn't dare turn on the heater. It had died sometime around Thanksgiving. In the back seat, Mason hugged his backpack to his chest, trying to look braver than any 11-year-old should ever have to. His eyes were tired, the kind of tired that comes from months of sleeping in borrowed spaces and living out of plastic bags. When the farmhouse finally came into view, Amber felt her breath catch, not from awe, but from the heavy weight of memory. The place looked smaller than she remembered, a weathered, time-scarred structure slumped at the top of a frost-covered hill. Paint peeled from the siding like old sunburn. The porch leaned in a worn-out, almost apologetic way. One shutter dangled crooked, tapping the wall with every push of the wind. Yet somewhere beneath all that fading gray, Amber could still see the home her grandmother once kept warm and alive. "This is it?" Mason asked quietly, his voice holding that restless, uncertain tremble kids get when they're trying not to disappoint you. Amber nodded. "Yeah, buddy. This is where I used to spend my summers." She forced a small smile. Well, it's got a lot of character," he snorted softly. "It's kind of spooky." "Only a little," she teased. Though the truth was, the house did look lonely, the way abandoned things sometimes do. Like they're waiting for someone to remind them they still matter. Amber stepped out first. The cold slapped her cheeks, waking every nerve. Gravel crunched under her boots as she walked toward the porch. She touched the railing. It felt chilled, stiff, but solid enough. When she pushed open the front door, it groaned like it hadn't been opened in a decade. Dust spiraled into the air, catching the fading sunlight like tiny ghosts drifting through the room. Inside smelled like old cedar, mothballs, and the faintest whisper of her grandmother's apple soap. The floorboards creaked under their weight, complaining, but somehow welcoming too, like the house was quietly hopeful they'd come back to stay. Mason wandered in behind her, eyes wide. "It feels kind of sad," he murmured. "Yeah," Amber whispered, "but maybe it just needs us." She wasn't sure if she believed that, but standing there, broke, exhausted, and more vulnerable than she'd ever admit, she realized something unexpected. For the first time in months, they weren't being pushed out of somewhere. They were stepping into a place that might actually let them stay. When Amber's gaze drifted to the empty picture frame bolted to the wall, perfectly centered, strangely untouched, she felt a small shiver run down her spine. Something about it didn't belong, and something about it almost felt like a warning. Or a beginning. Amber didn't know why the empty picture frame bothered her so much, but it did. Maybe it was because everything else in the farmhouse looked worn or forgotten, while this frame sat strangely perfect, cleaner than the walls around it, edges untouched by the dust that covered everything else. It was like someone had placed it there on purpose, not for decoration, but as a message. While Mason explored the kitchen, Amber stepped closer to the frame, brushing her fingers along its smooth wooden edge. The wallpaper behind it was darker, dust softened, untouched by sunlight. It hadn't been moved in decades, but something about it felt wrong. Not dangerous, just uneasy, like a whisper you couldn't quite hear but still felt in your bones. Behind her, Mason called out, "Mom, look! The stove still works!" Amber turned to see him pressing the knobs on the old propane range. A tiny flame sputtered and then bloomed to life. His face lit up, hopeful in that fragile, quietly excited way kids have when the world throws them even the smallest kindness. She smiled, letting that warmth wash over her for a moment before her eyes drifted back to the frame. "Hey, Mace," she said softly. "Come here for a sec." He patted into the living room, his sneakers making the floorboards complain. "What's up?" Amber tapped the frame. "Does this look weird to you?" He squinted, tilting his head the way he did when he tried to solve a puzzle. "It's kinda too clean." He shrugged. "Maybe Grandma liked it a lot?" "Maybe." But Amber could hear her grandmother's voice in her memory. Practical, no nonsense. Not the kind of woman who hung a picture frame without a picture. Especially not one perfectly centered like a museum piece. She pressed her thumb along the right edge, expecting nothing. Instead, there was a subtle, soft click. Amber jerked her hand back as the frame swung forward like a tiny door, revealing a shallow cavity carved neatly into the wall. Mason gasped so loudly she almost laughed from the shock alone. Inside was a small metal tin, its surface faintly familiar, etched with floral patterns she remembered from her childhood summers. Beneath it lay a bundle of folded papers tied with twine, edges yellowed, fragile as dried leaves. "Whoa," Mason whispered. "Mom, this is like those treasure hunts on YouTube." Amber's pulse quickened, part fear, part wonder. "Yeah," she breathed. "Something like that." Her hands trembled as she eased the tin out, its weight oddly comforting, heavy enough to matter, light enough to say it wasn't money. Whatever it held, it had been hidden for a reason. For the first time since they arrived, Amber felt something shift in the room, a delicate, almost haunting sense that the house wasn't just sheltering them. It was trying to tell them something. Amber set the metal tin on the old kitchen table, its surface cold against her palms. Mason dragged a chair beside her, his excitement nearly vibrating off him. The farmhouse felt unusually still, as if the walls themselves were listening. Amber unlatched the tin, the hinges letting out a weather-stained groan, and lifted the lid. Inside were black and white photographs, faded scalloped edges showing people in overalls, women standing stiffly on the porch when the farmhouse was still young. Beneath them were documents, surveys, handwritten notes, and at the very bottom, a hand-drawn map. Amber unfolded it carefully. The paper felt fragile, soft like old cloth. Ink lines traced the property, the hills, the creek, the fields. But one thing stood out, a bold X drawn deep in the north field, marked with the word Springhouse. Mason leaned in. "What's a springhouse?" "It's like an old-fashioned storage place," Amber murmured. "People use them before fridges. Grandma used to talk about one, but she said it collapsed before I was born." "Maybe she was wrong," Mason shrugged. Kids didn't carry the same skepticism adults did. His innocence had a way of making even the impossible feel subtly believable. Amber studied the map again. The mark wasn't random. It was deliberate, almost stubborn in the way it was circled. Why would her grandmother hide something like this? Why leave clues? Her heart fluttered with that restless, uneasy curiosity she hadn't felt in years, like standing on the edge of something bigger than herself. Behind them, the wind rattled a loose window pane, making Amber jump. She exhaled, half laughing. "This house is going to scare the life out of me." Mason grinned, trying to be brave. "Maybe it's helping us, like showing us stuff." His words hit her harder than she expected. Maybe that was exactly what was happening. She turned the map over. On the back was a short note in Eleanor's handwriting, familiar, steady, unmistakable. "If you ever come back, follow the truth the land remembers." Amber swallowed, emotion catching her off guard. Her grandmother wasn't poetic, not in life. She'd been blunt, practical. But this felt almost raw, honest in a way that settled deep inside Amber's chest. "We're going tomorrow," Amber said, folding the map carefully, "to see what's out there." Mason's eyes widened with a mix of fear and excitement. "Really?" "Yeah, really." Her voice was steady, but inside her pulse was anything but. As Amber placed the map back into the tin, she felt a quiet truth settle over her. Something mysterious, faintly alarming, and yet somehow comforting. The house wasn't finished revealing itself, and whatever lay beneath that X had been waiting for them for a very, very long time. Amber woke before the sun, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest ever since she found the map. The air inside the farmhouse was cold, sharp enough to make her breath fog, but it wasn't just the winter chill keeping her awake. Something about the discovery, about that circled X, made her feel like she was holding a match over dry grass. By mid-morning, she and Mason drove into town for groceries and propane. The moment Amber stepped into the small general store, the shift was immediate. People looked up. Conversations paused. A few nodded politely, but others stared in that tight-lipped, wary way that made her feel like unwanted news. Mrs. Hall, the cashier who used to slip her peppermints as a kid, glanced at her with a forced smile. "Heard you're staying at the old Ellis farmhouse again," she said, tone casual but eyes curiously sharp. "Didn't think anyone would touch that place after Eleanor passed." Amber forced her own smile. "Just trying to get by." Mrs. Hall hesitated. "Well, folks around here have long memories." The words weren't unkind, but they carried an unsettling weight, as if they meant more than they said. When Amber stepped outside with Mason, a sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop beside them. Sheriff Colton Hayes stepped out, tall and calm, his expression unreadable. He took off his hat and offered Mason a small smile before turning back to Amber. "Heard word you're fixing up the farmhouse," he said, tone gentle but cautious. "Town's been talking." Amber's stomach tightened. "Talking about what?" "Some think the property should have gone to the Historical Society," Hayes said. "Others think it shouldn't be lived in at all." He paused. "And a few folks are wondering if Eleanor left behind anything." The way he said anything made Amber's pulse jump. A subtle warning, a subtle question, both wrapped in one. "I'm just cleaning," she said, trying to sound steady. "Nothing more." Hayes studied her for a moment, his gaze protective, not threatening. "Amber, if you find something, you keep your head down. Not everyone in this town wants history uncovered." He tipped his hat and drove off, leaving her standing in the cold with Mason gripping her sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, "do they know about the map?" "No," Amber swallowed, "and they're not going to." But as they drove back toward the farmhouse, snow beginning to drift across the road, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that the town's attention was a storm gathering around them, quiet, slow, and dangerously fragile. She had wanted answers. Now she wasn't sure she wanted anyone knowing she had them. Something told her the truth buried under that X was bigger than just her family, and someone else might already be looking for it. The wind howled around the farmhouse that night, shaking the shutters and slipping cold air through every crack in the walls. Amber sat at the kitchen table long after Mason had fallen asleep, the lantern's glow flickering across the metal tin and the raw, time-stained map she had unfolded again and again. It felt different now, heavier, more dangerous, because the whispers in town made one thing clear. The secret buried beneath the Ellis land wasn't just a family matter. It was a target. Amber's fingers brushed across the parchment, tracing the ridges of her grandmother's handwriting. "If you ever come back, follow the truth the land remembers." There was something achingly honest, almost desperate, in those words. Eleanor had wanted her to find this, but she had also wanted it hidden. Amber swallowed hard. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she whispered into the quiet room, her voice trembling with the weight of uncertainty. She didn't have an answer, only a sense of protective instinct rising from someplace deep. She had lost jobs, lost homes, lost pride, but she would not lose the safety of her son, or the land her grandmother fought to preserve. The next morning, snow blanketed the ground in a soft, delicate sheet of white. Mason trudged into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Are we still going out to the spring house?" Amber hesitated, her worry knotting in her chest. "We are," she finally said. "But we're going to be careful, okay? Really careful." They bundled up and stepped outside, their boots crunching through the snow. The north field stretched ahead, silent, untouched, and eerily vulnerable in the pale morning light. When they reached the old spring house, the roof sagged with years of weather and memory. The stones around the base were the same ones marked on the map. "It's right here," Mason said, breath misting in the cold. "Look." Amber knelt beside him. Beneath a loosened slab of stone lay a small wooden chest, perfectly preserved, almost as if the earth itself had protected it. Her hands shook as she lifted it out. The wood was chilled, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. Eleanor's husband had built things just like it. Inside were more maps, geological surveys, letters stamped with government seals, and one envelope bearing her name. Her breath hitched. She opened it slowly. Eleanor's handwriting, steady, confident, filled the page. "Some secrets were buried to keep this mountain safe. If you find them, guard them gently. Money changes people. Power destroys towns. But land remembers who protects it." Amber felt tears well. For the first time, she truly understood. Eleanor hadn't been hiding treasure. She had been hiding temptation. And now the responsibility had fallen to Amber. Mason looked up at her with wide, fearful, trusting eyes. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Amber pulled him close. "No, honey, we're not in trouble." She wiped her cheek. "We're just on the right side of something really big." On the way back to the farmhouse, Amber made her decision. She stored everything, the maps, the letters, the surveys, in the false bottom sewing table she found earlier. She locked it, then tucked the key where only she and Mason would know. That night, as the storm rolled back across the hills, Amber stood on the porch, staring out at the sprawling darkness of the mountain. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel powerless. She felt resolute, grounded, quietly powerful. Eleanor had given her more than a house. She had given her a purpose. Amber whispered into the wind. I'll protect it, I promise. The breeze shifted, soft as a nod. Inside, Mason called for her. Amber stepped back into the warm glow of the lantern, closing the porch door behind her. Closing, too, the first chapter of a legacy she never expected, but was finally ready to carry. Question for the audience. If you were Amber, struggling, with nowhere left to go, yet holding a secret that could change the entire town, would you reveal the truth or protect it the way Eleanor did? Share your thoughts with us. Call to subscribe. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming emotional stories. Thank you for watching until the end.